Yeah, and I guess I would just like to reiterate that comment that I'm not strictly probably a heritage professional. Many of you in the audience will be much more so than I am in that respect. I am a landscape architect, and I guess I put my interest in heritage landscape down to the way that I was trained as a landscape architect. I trained as a landscape architect at Lincoln, and pretty much all of my tutors were British trained landscape architects, and the distinction between heritage landscape and landscape wasn't really one that we made. To me, in the way that I was trained, landscape is about heritage. The landscape that we have today is the result of the natural landscape and what humankind and time have done to that landscape. And so that's the way that I have always perceived landscape architecture and landscape, and I guess that's really sort of what I want a wee bit to sort of bring to you as my background perspective in terms of this talk to you today. There are three things broadly that I'd like to cover in terms of content, and they are around particularly some work that Auckland City has been doing recently, which I think give us really good tools at the moment across Auckland City and the Isthmus, and then hopefully and trustfully into the Auckland Council in terms of tools for heritage landscape and understanding the heritage landscape that we have and how we can move forward with that as Auckland continues to change. I think personally that now is a good time for heritage in Auckland in terms of really looking to inform the way our communities develop and we change and grow and develop our identity and sense of place, and so we'll talk a wee bit about that. And then really that message, I guess, overall is in terms of heritage being about the future, but I think we need to not see heritage as something that exists in the past, but that to be meaningful it really needs to be very much of our daily life now and be part of the meaning of the communities and the place that we live in. So when you start to think about heritage landscape and what makes Auckland distinctive, you can't but start with the natural landscape of Auckland. And Hochstedter's 1830 map, which apart from being a really beautiful piece of cartography, really speaks to the underlying strength of the natural landscape of Auckland, the combination of the volcanic field of Auckland and then the two harbours of the city. And those things really do give Auckland the sort of natural landscape setting which, you know, do give it that opportunity to be unsurpassed in the world, if you like, in terms of the natural basis of the heritage landscape of Auckland. And I think this quote that the young John Logan Campbell, as he is looking to be part of establishing the township of Auckland in this natural landscape, and the language that he uses in terms of standing entranced in mute amazement at the wonderful beauty of the glorious landscape. Sort of that concept of how strong that natural landscape character is as a basis of the starting point of Auckland's heritage landscape, I think is something that is really important to Auckland today. And then when you look at the sort of the same scale, and I know it's really washed out as an aerial, but you know the same Hochstetter scale map of Auckland, and it becomes very readily apparent in a cultural sense that the landscape is much changed from that natural structure, and yet I think at the same time, you know, the bones of the city in a natural landscape sense are still very clear. I think it was Paul Moraine, who was one of your earlier Mayoral Conversation speakers, a British urban designer, who said, "Thank God for Auckland's natural landscape, because pretty much everything else you've done to it since was a sort of abysmal mess." And I think he was unnecessarily harsh, as overseas experts can sometimes be. There are certainly bits of Auckland that I think are important parts of our built heritage as well, but there isn't much of Auckland's landscape that isn't much changed in terms of the cultural pattern of land use in that overlay. And I think too, one of the conversations that I enjoy or remember enjoying having with George Farrant was around the fact that, you know, it's not Auckland's volcanic field that's the outstanding thing, it's the fact that Auckland City is built on the volcanic field of Auckland that makes that combination of unique natural landscape and cultural endeavour, if you like, that give Auckland this very distinctive landscape heritage. One of the things that I always like to do is to think about, well, how do we convey ourselves in terms of landscape and the way that, how do we want people to see us? I think the use of postcards is quite an interesting way of just doing that little survey. So this is the Queen Street souvenir shop survey of what's Auckland saying about itself, and does that combination of the natural landscape and our cultural overlay, how does that come together in terms of those images that we do use to send overseas and to our friends, and what do we say? And I think, this image kind of encaptures to me, that very strong juxtaposition between the volcanic landscape of Auckland, Mangawhao in the foreground, and the harbour, the Waitemata, and the relationship of the central area and the wider city to that harbour landscape. And almost the protected view shaft from Onuara Road, looking across the harbour to probably one of the best arrivals within Auckland, if you like, coming across towards the Harbour Bridge, and that relationship again between the volcanic natural landscape of the city, the urban conglomeration of the central area itself, and the harbour. And then again, this image speaks to that same sort of relationship between Pukawa, the volcanic cone within the Auckland domain, the relationship of the Auckland War Memorial Museum in terms of its topographical high point within the domain, the vegetation very much about the acclimatisation of early tree species within Auckland from overseas, and then that relationship of that green open space again to the central city and harbour. And the museum is clearly, one of our iconic buildings in terms of heritage, but also that landscape relationship and its proud position, if you like, looking over the harbour and arriving into the harbour is really important to its sort of relationship to the city as well. And I thought nicely framed here by the Pukawa, which would have to be, New Zealand's most distinctive tree species. A slide or a postcard, which in itself is a historical fabrication now, of course, because there is no longer the tree, and just the monument, which makes that connection in terms of people to Auckland as well, and that relationship of built artifice, people, and the volcanic landscape. But I was really pleased to find this postcard, because I think, it really starts to also talk about the way Auckland's early suburbs related to the central area. They're very strong patterning in terms of quite a dense layout of urban development, the ridgeline roads, which you can sort of read there, and the relationship to the coast and coastline. Herne Bay here in the foreground and Ponsonby falling back down from the Jervois Road Ridge, very much sort of key residential one sorts of suburbs, and a really strong sort of pattern of urban development in relation to the central area, but also to the coast.